From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is Update One, the club's official podcast. It features newsworthy stories originating from the NPC facilities, as well as broader topics related to journalism, communications, press freedom, and transparency.
I'm Adam Konowe, co-chair of the National Press Club's broadcast podcast team. Joining me is Jody Beck, a fellow club member. She is also author of the new book, Your Loving Son, Ty, a World War II story of hope and horror in the Pacific. Jody, welcome to Update One.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start at the beginning. Who was Madsen Cobb Kokjer, nicknamed Ty, and what's the family connection?
He was my mother's cousin. Madsen and Kokjer are Danish names, and Cobb was his mother's maiden name. Baseball legend Ty Cobb was very popular in 1919 when he was born, so that was his name for the rest of his life.
Ty grew up in Nebraska and started university there, but ultimately chose to enlist in the Army. Why?
He was restless after 5 semesters in college, and his ROTC instructor suggested he apply to be a pilot in either the Army or the Navy. This was 1940, early 1940. The military was recruiting young men with at least 2 years of college to become pilots. And it was part of a buildup in forces that the administration thought might deter Japan or Germany from attacking. Ty thought it would be an adventure. He qualified for both the Navy and the Army, and he chose the Army Air Corps, which became the Army Air Forces while he was in training.
Can you tell us a little bit first about the letters and the diaries that he wrote?
I didn't know Ty existed until I was in my 30s. I was visiting my family in Lincoln, Nebraska, and my mother handed me a transcript of his diary. I was stunned. I didn't know he existed. I knew very little about World War II. And then when I began to work on the book many years later, my aunt and uncle, my mother's sister, and her husband pulled a suitcase out of their basement. It contained more than 400 letters. Most were from Ty when he was in pilot training. Others were letters his parents sent to him after he deployed, although mail service was cut off very shortly after he got there, so he only got 2 from them. The rest came back. So I had 24 letters from his parents, and his mother kept a scrapbook, and there were a few other letters that Ty's parents sent to Manila and to Australia that came back, and his mother kept everything.
So you mentioned about Ty training to be a pilot, but he actually never got the chance to fly in combat. His service in the Philippines started in relative peace, but then the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and other American bases in the Pacific changed that. So what did you learn about his initial wartime experiences?
His initial service was peaceful. So he didn't have much to do. They were waiting for their planes to arrive. They assumed their planes would get there. And MacArthur was convinced he had enough troops. So he did whatever he was asked to do. The pilots held out hope for far longer than they should have, or, hope was all they had at some point. They assumed their planes had been sent to Australia. They hoped they would be taken to the southern island of Mindanao and then to Australia to get their planes. But the attack on Japan on December 8th, hours after Pearl Harbor, meant that was not possible. So he did whatever his superiors asked him to do. He did beach patrol. He built machine gun nests. He searched for food, which everybody did at one point. And he did write some criticisms of those who planned poorly, he thought, for the war. But he basically held out hope and did what he was asked to do.
When America surrendered the Philippines in 1942, Ty was one of thousands who were forced into what became known as the Bataan Death March. What do we know through Ty about that painful period and his temporary escape?
The march was truly cruel. When you read the accounts, I sometimes had to stop because it was so hard to read. Ty didn't describe quite as much cruelty as some of the others on the march. He said he would tell his parents after the war. He said that in several occasions in his diary. I'm a little surprised he had a harder time on the march than some others, but he did lose track of some of his friends, and having friends was crucial to survival. He was grateful to that family who cared for him once he escaped from the march. And he wrote about that many, many times. And his opinions of the people who were around him, the Filipinos who were around him, changed over time. He said some of the poorest Filipinos who had barely any possessions were nonetheless happy, which surprised him. And at first he thought the more wealthier people were cruel, but his opinion of them changed over time because of their charity to him and to two other soldiers he hid out with.
I want to talk a little bit more about this escape. So he hid with a Filipino family. So what do his notes and your book say about them and what their motivation was, and do we know what their fate was?
Most Filipinos did not want Japan to take over their country. They'd been a possession of Spain for something like 400 years, and the United States took over after the Spanish-American War, which they weren't thrilled about. In fact, there was fighting in the early 1900s because of that. But they were happy with the changes the Americans made to the country, improving infrastructure, roads, schools, and things like that. And the United States had set a date for the Philippines to become independent in 1946. So they knew independence was coming. It seems that most of those who helped Thai survive the war. There are some photographs. They also trusted MacArthur, and he was still mostly well-liked and almost revered in the Philippines. And I was treated well when I was there last year. Our group was welcomed. I don't know if it was just the beginning of tourism because our bus was labeled that we were Americans here to find out more about their experiences in World War II. So his opinions about people changed and improved over the years, over the months when Thai was in captivity.
Thai was ultimately recaptured and sadly did not survive to see Japan surrender in 1945. So what have you been able to piece together, and what methods did you have to use?
I read a lot of memoirs. The two bookshelves behind me are full of books about the Philippines. I read memoirs by or about men who were in the same place at the same time as Thai, so I could assume he had similar experiences. One of the memoirs was about one of the few men who survived the so-called hospital where Thai was taken in Japan. Friends gave that to Thai's parents as a gift when it was published. Otherwise, I might not have found that book because a lot of memoirs and books about World War II are disappearing from libraries, although used bookstores are a friend if you're doing historical research. Thai's parents talked to many returning POWs. They would hear somebody was returning. They would send that person a letter. Many of them wrote back. They were in Lincoln at the time. They had moved from the tiny town in western Nebraska where they lived. And POWs are sometimes housed at a hotel in Lincoln. So they would go to the hotel and talk to POWs. So they wrote anybody they could. So those books and letters mean I can describe Thai's last weeks or last months with the caveat that these are memoirs written by other people, who some of whom knew Thai and some of whom did not.
Among the letters you collected was a last one from Thai, handwritten the day before he and roughly 1,900 other POWs were loaded onto a so-called hell ship for Japan. That must have been among the most poignant letters to read. And what do we know about that subsequent voyage?
I had to stop reading that. It was so sad because I knew his parents got that much later, but I knew they would never hear from him again. So I didn't know Thai, but I knew his parents well. They both died when I was in college. But the voyage he was on of the ship called the Oriuku Maru was really cruel. One author said death camps were bad, but the ships were worse. The POW camps were bad, but the ships were worse. And as of now, there are only 300 survivors in the end, many of whom were interviewed, many of whom wrote their memoirs or were, others wrote about them. But, later, Japanese documents became available, American documents became available, and memoirs of others became available. So we know a fair amount about that journey and how awful it was.
As mentioned earlier, Thai did not survive to see Japan's eventual defeat. When and where did he pass?
The ship docked in Moji, Japan, which is toward the south near the coal mining area where most of the POWs were meant to work, although very few of them were alive and very few of them were able to work. So about 400 men of the 1,600 who boarded the ship in Manila were still alive. And I don't know the answer to this. Thai was either forced to go to the hospital or he volunteered to go to the hospital thinking he would get medical care. He was in the hold of one of the replacement ships for the first ship when it was bombed. And I don't have any record that he might have been injured, but he might have been injured. But I don't know. So he chose, or he was forced to go to the hospital. And of the 100 who were there, 76 died. And he died in that hospital February 12th, 1945. His parents found out about his death in September after the war ended.
And his parents visited Japan in 1958 with a group of other Americans visiting that location of Thai's death, as well as his grave at Manila American Cemetery. What more can you add about that trip?
So I have a few photos, but I don't have any written letters or documents. They went with a group of other Americans who had lost husbands or sons during the war, and I have a photograph of the group, but nothing much in writing. Being at the grave, I'm sure, had to be a very emotional moment for them, as it was for me, surprisingly. But I know that they were in Japan. They talked to people there. They were at the place where that so-called hospital was. So they could at least visualize their son, only child, his last days.
You planned to visit the Philippines originally in 2020, but naturally COVID-19 got in the way of that. When you finally got there in 2023, what did you see and hear, and what blanks did that fill in for you?
It was mostly the feeling I got being in the same places as he was. The Philippines have changed tremendously in the last 80 years. When Thai got there, Manila was just under 700,000. Today, it's something like 13 million. They have preserved a lot of the historic places and documents, but a lot has changed in 80 years. But visiting the prison in Manila, where he was twice, once when he was recaptured and once before they put him on the ship, and then being, in the other places he was, including Subic Bay, where he was twice, and the Cabanatuan prisoner of war camp, where he spent 20 months. Visiting his grave and knowing that it's hard for family members to get there. It's a long ways away. It was an unexpectedly emotional moment for me. I was with a group and I was invited to talk about him while I was at his grave. And at first I had a hard time talking, but most of the people on the trip also had relatives who had died in the Philippines or maybe had made it back.
Different time, but here we are in 2024. The world is on the brink of a number of conflicts. Communications has changed dramatically, not even since 1940, from the 1940s, the time of Thai, but through your own career, going as far back as Watergate and more recent decades. So in writing a book like this that's so based on written first-person accounts, what do you take away from that from a communications perspective?
Well, my book wouldn't have been possible without all of those letters and Thai's diary, which we know he buried before he was recaptured. And one of the family members knew where it was, and I assumed they dug it up. I don't know this for sure, but the Army had it. The Army was in the town. We think they just took it to the Army and said, here, we haven't seen him for more than 2 years. But without those letters and the diary, I don't think I could have written anything other than maybe a magazine article. But today, we have instant communication, and this worries historians that there won't be the record of future conflicts. When my uncle was in Vietnam, he and my aunt and the rest of the family exchanged reel-to-reel audio tapes or cassette tapes. So you would get the tape would come to their home, they would erase it and record over it and send it back. So most of those conversations are gone. I know my aunt has collected a lot of information about that. But today, soldiers overseas can text or call or email their families. So historians are worried about that. If there's a veteran in your family, I suggest you do an interview with that person and collect whatever papers you can now before it's too late.
Great advice. Jody, thanks so much for your time.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Jody Beck is author of Your Loving Son, Thai. For Update One in Washington, I'm Adam Konowe.
You have been listening to Update One, the official podcast of the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists and a vigorous advocate of press freedom worldwide. If you have any questions or comments about Update One, send an email to updateonepodcast@gmail.com.